Welcome to Storytelling.
This week's guest is a founder and director of Greater Manchester Mediation. With over 30 years' experience as a family solicitor and mediator, she helps clients navigate personal and professional challenges with empathy and insight. Her mindful approach fosters conscious communication, emotional awareness, and practical strategies for navigating difficult conversations, helping couples and professionals find clarity, maintain family values, and achieve harmonious resolutions during times of change. Please welcome Bernadette Willems. Hello, Bernadette, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Debbie, and thank you very much for having me.
Bernadette, mindful mediation is a core aspect of your work. So for those unfamiliar with the term, what exactly is mindful mediation, and how does it differ from more traditional mediation approaches?
Okay, well, I would say that mindful mediation, the way that I use it is that I help clients to be more aware of the communication style that they have, partly because as a trained mindset coach, I'm very conscious that the words that we use has a massive impact on our behavior and the results that we get. So if you're mindful about what you're saying to somebody that you are in conflict with, you're going to have a much greater control over the outcome than if you just react to what they say or the situation. And I think that that differs from traditional mediation in the sense that as a mediator, you don't have to necessarily be experienced or trained in communication and the real history of communication in this, or the depths of communication, where you are controlling what you're saying. And that might sound a little bit contrived, but it isn't, in the sense that we are all conscious of that inner chatter that we have in our head, which is happening all the time. But when you start analysing that chatter, is that chatter helping you or is it hindering you? And what I help my clients with in the mindful mediation is to actually be aware of that chatter. Is it helping them or is it hindering them? And that helps the clients to get an easier result in the sense that it's quicker, it's much more proactive, and it's much more conciliatory.
From a client's perspective, when some may be emotionally charged, how do you get them to be focused on that type of communication?
Well, the way that I like to use the mindful mediation is that I will see clients both together and separately. It's a hybrid system in the sense that when I see them separately, I can identify what it is that they're wanting to achieve out of that mediation. And then I can also identify how they're expressing that to me. Does it sound aggressive? Does it sound confrontational? Or does it sound as though you're having a civilized approach to the whole matter? So are you respectful of the other person? Are you mindful of the effect it might have on your children if there are children involved? Because I'm very conscious that the way that parents speak to each other, they model a behavior for their children. And part of my mindful mediation is about them being mindful about the effect that the way that they're managing their divorce and separation and the conversations that they're having around it, is it having a beneficial effect on the children, or is it actually sort of harming them in the sense that they are either the victims of it, or they perceive themselves to be the victims of it, or they feel guilty about the behavior that their parents are demonstrating? Or are they being a pawn where they're having to pass messages from one parent to the other?
How does this translate for your average client? Because you've been a solicitor for many years, and how has this approach evolved over the years? What role does mindfulness play in that evolution?
Okay, well, I started work, like you say, as a solicitor, and I was doing a lot of contentious work and divorce and separation. And when my children came along, I wanted to really be around for my children, able to take them to school and collect them and be, if you like, a hands-on parent. But when you've got a full-time career and job, that can be very difficult. I appreciate that this is something that, a lot of people have to contend with. But I was fortunate in the position that I was able to sort of look and see how could I manage my time better. And it was just around the time that mediation was being introduced into England and into the legal system. When I sort of was introduced to it, it suddenly made such a lot of sense because it meant that the clients themselves were in control of the outcome. Right, so they took responsibility for the solutions that they had, rather than passing it to a solicitor or a barrister and then ultimately a judge. And the other thing that was really helpful was that they were communicating together, because essentially they would have the opportunity of having a full and frank conversation in a safe and confidential environment. And the mediator would be the facilitator. The mediator would be able to guide the clients back to the issues that needed to be discussed, rather than the clients sometimes going off on a tangent and deciding to sort of have a bit of a rant at each other, which wouldn't be helpful. So that's the traditional style. And then obviously once an agreement has been reached, the mediator would then draft a memorandum of understanding, which then is fed back, if you like, into the legal system, where the solicitors will draft a consent order, and that is then ratified by the court as the final divorce. What I've realised over those years is that the communication between clients was flawed, in the sense that they didn't really know how to express what they were trying to say in a way that the other person would be responding in a way that was helpful, rather than reacting to that comment. And I sort of got very curious about, why do people communicate the way that they do? And so I trained as a master practitioner in NLP. And NLP obviously can give you a huge amount of insight into how people communicate. And effectively, communication is the response you get. So if you don't get the response that you're expecting, you've obviously expressed something wrong or inaccurately. And that sort of carried on, in the sense that I was thinking, okay, how does the mind work? So I was very interested in the research that was going on in neural pathways and things like that. And it then became apparent that the thoughts that we have and how the mind works has an impact on our behavior and then the results that we have. There's an art and a science to it. And so what I'm trying to share with my mindful mediation clients is the art and science of how you communicate.
So communication seems to be key to a relationship, whether it's at the beginning or nearing the end of that cycle. Has there been any surprises in terms of when clients realize that there's a different way to communicate?
Oh, massively, because I've had situations where people were really at the brink of the divorce, had gone through the mediation, and in fact, the process had been stalled because they were waiting for pension information, and pension information can sometimes take a long time to filter through. And during that time, my clients have learned to communicate better. And I've had on a number of occasions clients that decided, actually, we're going to give our relationship another try.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me is very satisfying, in the sense that sometimes breakups happen because life gets in the way, and the initial attraction that brought people together is lost in the busyness of life, the responsibilities you have of running a family, running a home, running a business, you name it. And that can then sort of mean that the clients start to diverge on different paths. And the communication that they have is just factual. It's not really cultivating and developing their relationship. And that's where the communication then dries up, because it doesn't happen enough.
You mentioned earlier about the communication of children who may be stuck in the middle of a separation. How does your technique support them? Is it via their parents who are learning to communicate, or do you bring them into the process as well?
No, I don't bring them into the process. Some mediators will do consultations with children. I think that can be problematic in the sense that it's very good for a child's wishes and feelings to be heard, but I think it can be an onus on them that they feel they have the responsibility to try and sort out their parents' dispute. And also they have the problem that perhaps whatever they are expressing as they'd like to happen, their parents don't actually follow that through because their parents are on a different path. And that can be a problem in a lot of relationships where the way that people want to bring up their children is very different to their partner's way of doing things. But that's all part of a relationship, and having and learning to compromise and learning to work together with different ideas and different habits and different beliefs. And that, when it works well, works extremely well. So parents will display a different style, but they will also be working together to ensure that their child feels secure and loved and supported in everything. I think I've gone a little bit off track on what you were asking me, but I think the important thing from the children's perspective is that if they see that their parents are modelling a good and respectful and civilized way of communicating with each other, they can then see that even in challenging situations, solutions can be found by dealing with them in a much more conciliatory way rather than just sort of kicking off and reacting and being aggressive and bombastic and all those things which can really sort of just create more angst and worry to everybody concerned.
Can mediators be impartial?
I think we're taught to be impartial. I think that's a very good question. My feeling is that if I feel I can't be impartial, I wouldn't take on the clients. I think I've only refused perhaps half a dozen over my 30 years of mediating. My view is that I'm there just to sort of oversee what they want to happen. I've got no sort of capital or interest in their solution. What I want them to know is that it's going to work for them. So I will sort of ask very challenging questions so that we can identify, are they really going to follow on what they're saying? Is what they're saying realistic in their circumstances? And also, if things go wrong, so for instance, it's about looking into the future, because you may have a couple who have got young children, but the relationship isn't working, isn't salvageable. But the chances are that either parent are going to meet somebody else. So what are the thoughts that they are going to have when a new person is then brought into that situation? And it's a question of, are they going to introduce that person to the children without telling the other parent? Are they going to be respectful that they're going to wait until that relationship is a steady relationship and is likely to be a long-term relationship? Or is it just that these are casual relationships that are in and out of the children's lives? And all of those things can have a real impact on children. If they then don't really know where they stand in all of these relationships. And you then have the situation also where you have a child who is going from one family to another because their parents are both remarried and living with new partners, and they are also half siblings. So it's very important for that child to feel really accepted into the new family unit. Because my own children have experienced friends who have felt very isolated because that's what's happened with their own parents, and they just feel that they're the fifth wheel of the cart because they just don't fit in anymore.
So a lot of people have mediation when things go wrong. Do you think it's worth having mediation before people commit to a relationship?
I think that's a very good question. And yes, I think it would be very helpful because I think it's about identifying what are the things that are important in a relationship. It's very much really about identifying what do you value? What do you see that relationship giving you, fulfilling you? And I suppose by asking those questions, I mean, you'd hope that a couple who are contemplating a life together would be asking those questions. But sometimes it's useful to ask it in a neutral environment and having somebody else there to sort of just facilitate that conversation. Again, like I said before, make sure that it stays in the realm of what is helpful to the client as opposed to straying.
Yeah.
I have a very interesting conversation with my family about prenups, which is a little bit similar to what you're suggesting here. And prenups can be very valuable in the sense that it can identify what might happen if a relationship fails. So how are things going to be separated? And that can be really useful to have that conversation, because essentially you're saying, you know, what you're bringing to a relationship remains yours. And that can be extremely valuable, particularly in second relationships, if you're wanting to preserve assets for your children and biological children. And what happens is that a lot of people say, well, prenups are not romantic. If you love somebody, you don't need to have a prenup because love transcends everything. But a lot of the time, you know, divorce cases, legal proceedings, mediations are all exactly about how are you going to separate those finances, because there hasn't been that arrangement done at the very beginning.
Are prenups adhered to in the legal system?
In England, they are not compulsory. They are explored. They are looked at to see how fair they are. On the continent, they are part of the legal system. I think they are followed more closely now, particularly with the advent of second marriages and second relationships. They are more popular, and so I think the courts do take notice of them generally, but they don't have to.
The main thing is that we learn the art of communication in advance, which may help you further along the line. So should there be a separation or a parting of the ways, and it's done as amicably as possible.
Yes, that's exactly it. And, you know, people who want to have an amicable relationship, what can happen is that once they go down the legal route, they then becomes contentious because the acting solicitor is only hearing one side of the story. This is where mediation, I feel very privileged, because I hear both sides of the story. And that can help the communication again and the exchange of information in a much more normal way, because it's done in a conversational way as opposed through emails and proceedings.
Bernadette, with all this in mind, what is the one positive takeaway that we can take from this?
Well, I think the positive takeaway is that if you go via the mediation route, you're going to save yourself a lot of money. It's going to probably work in a much quicker way, because the court's just overwhelmed with cases at the moment. And the other thing also is that because you've been communicating with your ex-partner face to face, or at least in the virtual environment, you can still communicate, because ultimately, you know, you want to be around for your children's milestones, and you want your children to be comfortable to have you both attend special days in their lives.
So you've worked with a lot of clients and you've done a lot of mindfulness mediation sessions. What has this taught you about yourself and your own family relationships?
I think how blessed I am. Got a long marriage. I have a wonderful husband and 3 wonderful children. I feel that part of the benefit that we have is that we are mindful of each other, and we are good at communicating with each other. We do share the same values and the same beliefs. So that's something that is, if you like, underpins a lot of the harmony that we have. But I also know that I think it's really important about having the same values. Okay. I'm so lucky that we have a very good relationship with our extended families as well. My own family history is that, you know, my mother was the youngest of 12, and every 7 years there's a family reunion of all the siblings, cousins and aunts and uncles. So we have a very tight family unit, really. And for me, that's really important. those relationships are invaluable.
Are there aspects of communication that you would want us all to consider in terms of having really good relationships, whether it's a partner or family member? What tip would you like to share with us?
I think it's being open to looking at things from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at something from a different angle, you see it differently. And I think part of the problem with conflict is that people see it only from their own perspective, their own viewpoint. But immediately that you can try changing that viewpoint, different ideas come into play as to how that might work out in a better way.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent advice. Bernadette, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your perspective and for sharing what it means to really have a communication within a relationship. And I want to thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast.
Well, Debbie, I want to thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and really, I've enjoyed every moment of it. Thank you.
If you would like further details about Bernadette, then please follow links in the show notes.